Hello, I'm Ted Morrissey. Just want to do a quick video. This is going to be about Virginia Woolf, um, and it's kind of inspired by the stories we read recently that, among other things, are about sort of men's dominance in their homes and particularly having kind of a space of their own that they can do whatever they like in, basically. And that reminded me of Virginia Woolf's classic, "A Room of One's Own." And since we're also reading Virginia Woolf's short story this week, "The Haunting," is that what it's called? Sorry, "A Haunted House." Yeah. Um, uh, Quick parenthetical note: it's a very short story if you haven't read it already. But it was the inspiration for the 2017 film A Ghost Story. And I definitely recommend that film, especially after reading the short story, although they're not too closely related. But it definitely was the inspiration for that film, according to the writer director of that movie, whose name unfortunately is escaping me at the moment. Um, but um, but yeah, I wanted to speak briefly about Virginia Woolf's kind of long essay. It's kind of hard to explain what this is, "A Room of One's Own." I uh, I have to admit, with just completely eaten up with shame, that I am not super familiar with Virginia Woolf's writings. I mean, I know what she wrote, I just haven't read very much of it, which again, that's on me, because I know it's certainly worthy of reading. My shirt down there. So the premise, though, of the book, which is almost self-explanatory, I suppose, is this idea of kind of what have held women back from achieving more in the arts, particularly in writing. And one of the things that she gets into, or the main thing that she gets into, is not having the sort of private space to do the sort of thinking and concentrating and so forth that one needs to really produce great literature, right? Um, Virginia Woolf, obviously, very important 20th century author. That's a laughable understatement. Just as kind of a side note, I'm a big William Gass fan, and he counted Virginia Woolf as one of his idols, one of the writers that really shaped him as a writer. He counted three women authors in particular: um, Woolf, Gertrude Stein, and the French author Colette. So I definitely recommend checking them out. I have read a fair amount of Gertrude Stein. I've been reading Colette off and on for a few years, largely because of William Gass's recommendation, basically. And I have read some Woolf, but not nearly as much as I ought to. So she's definitely on my list. But I have read A Room of One's Own. I did teach an introductory course in like an introduction to women authors at another college I used to teach at. And the last couple of times I taught it, I began by having students read at least parts of this book, as I thought that was kind of an interesting sort of way into the course as we looked at work by various women authors. Our course, of course, is focused exclusively on women authors of classic sci-fi and horror. So there's sort of a connection there. But again, Wolf is looking at this idea of what a writer needs in order to be creative and successful, and artistically successful is probably a better way of putting it. Just a little bit of background on this book. Um, it stemmed out of two lectures that Virginia Woolf was asked to give in 1928 at women's colleges. Um, there were women's colleges because women were not allowed to go to, um, other colleges that men had had access to throughout history. So there were these sort of specialized colleges for women. So she spoke at and gave a couple of lectures. And then the following year, 1929, her press that she and her husband, she was Virginia, Leonard Woolf founded Hogarth Press. They produced A Room of One's Own, and we're not quite sure exactly the correlation. We know that the book grew out of those two lectures, but we don't really know exactly what she said, where, and then how that kind of filtered into the book itself. But the thesis is certainly consistent. And she looks at a lot of issues related to women being deprived of education, women being deprived of access to making their own money, women being deprived the time and the space to pursue their intellectual endeavors, including artistic endeavors like writing and painting and so forth. And in particular, she writes near the beginning of the book, and this is an idea that she comes back to repeatedly. A woman must have money and a room of her own if she is to write fiction. And I think that's true of anyone, that having some means of support and having time and space to focus on one's art are important, obviously, for both men and women and they, right? But obviously, it's traditionally a lot of men have had that access. They've had the time and the space and the wherewithal to focus on writing and painting and writing music or whatever they want to do, whereas women have had much less opportunity to do that. Now, one would hope in the 20th, the latter half of the 20th century and then into the 21st century, that has changed dramatically, and I think it has changed. But I think we certainly could make the case that it certainly is not equal yet. That women still have a much less of a chance to have those opportunities than what their male counterparts often have, and that's for a whole host of reasons. Much of which, if not 95% of it, is still rooted in the patriarchy that is so pervasive in our culture. But it does bring up some interesting issues for us as writers, because again, I think writers do need that time and that space to just sort of be by themselves and to work on their art, and not be distracted, by household, needs, by worrying about, where the next paycheck is coming from, and all those kinds of things. I don't know if you're familiar with the novelist and sort of public intellectual Will Self. He's a really interesting guy. He has a series of YouTube videos. I would definitely check him out. But I know one of the videos of his that I've watched, he talks about the thing that writers need more than anything else is just alone time, like gobs and gobs of alone time. I'm not quoting directly here, but this idea that to write a novel, for example, one needs to be able to just sort of be in one's head without interruption for long periods of time. And I certainly believe that's true. I've mentioned elsewhere, and I've written about, when I was, when the kids were all home and we had a house full of stuff happening, the only way that I could find the time to write on a consistent basis was to get up just really early. I'd get up at like 5 o'clock in the morning every day, or Monday through Friday, and walk the dog when the kids were little, get their breakfast going, get their lunches packed, make sure their clothes were clean for school, and get them up and going and so forth. But yet, if I got up at 5, I could still squeeze out about a half hour or so of just alone time before that circus would begin in earnest, and I could write a little bit and focus and so forth. luckily, in more recent years, I've had much more time to myself, and it is pretty heavenly, I got to tell you, to have that kind of a time and space. But I think a lot of people, it's really difficult to come by that. Especially again if you are married or have a partner, if you have kids in the house. If you obviously are working a lot of hours, maybe you have multiple jobs, as I did. When the kids were all home, still do, even though the kids aren't home anymore. And so I think it's hard to squeeze out that time to just be by yourself, kind of in your own head, and so on. So anyway, I'm gonna stop there. I didn't want to make a particularly long video, but it's an interesting concept. Both this idea of do writers in particular, or all kinds of creative folk, do they need that alone, that quiet time, that time in their own head to really produce great art, or can they do it with all kinds of things happening? We have examples of that, by the way. I mentioned in writing in the discussion board that we know, for example, Jane Austen wrote in the parlor of their house, kind of in a little table in the corner. And so as people were coming and going in the family, she had this kind of big family with lots of in-laws and nieces and nephews and so forth and so on. As all that was happening, she would be there kind of in her own little world, amidst the chaos around her at times, I suppose, doing her writing. Another of my favorite examples is Alex Haley, the author of Roots. He would write in this really noisy, busy cafe in Atlanta, I believe. So he'd go and he'd sit at the counter, and drink a cup of coffee and write in a notebook or whatever. And meanwhile, like I said, it was this really busy, noisy, kind of greasy spoon counter. And then after Roots was this, huge mega success, and he had all sorts of money rolling in. He and his wife bought a really big house, and she, got to decorating it, and she kind of created for him like the ultimate writer's den, so that he could, work on his next book, in this perfect, writerly environment. And he couldn't write a word. He couldn't tell her that after all the work she put into creating the space for him, that he couldn't write there. So he would sneak out and go to that old diner he used to write in and write. And that went on, I think, for months, if I remember the story correctly, before his wife finally figured out, that he was sneaking out of the house to get some writing done because his space was just too quiet. He was just too used to the chaos. I guess one can get used to anything. So anyway, I'd be interested to hear what your kind of writing working environment is, and what would it be ideally if you could design that kind of thing. But I will stop there, and I will see you down the digital road.